Take mine.
No, she's got a program that.
There it is. You're on.
These are all.
Thank you, Steve.
Is your mic on? Oh, mine is. I got mine.
Everybody ready? Rob, you all set? Tony, you all set? I'm going. Yeah. This is a call to order the special meeting of the Ducktown Council, April 6, 2022. And at this time, we have one agenda item. We're going to get a report back from Ken Wilson and Weeks Marine. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Ken Wilson. How are you, Ken?
Doing well. Good to be up here. Good weather today, and yeah, anytime we get to come up and have a meeting like this, we're excited because that means the fun stuff is about to begin. So we're getting really close, but I want to glad to be up here today. As I said, do a little bit of introductions as far as it's not just me today. I've got some other folks both from our team at CPE and from Weeks Marine, and then we'll go through kind of a little bit of an outline, give you guys some background, talk a little bit about the design, and then we'll get into a bunch of construction photos so that folks that have been through it already, a little bit of a refresher, but maybe some folks that are following on the internet or so forth that weren't around for the last project get a little bit more familiar of what this is going to look like. So again, my name's Ken Wilson. I'm the project manager. I'm with Coastal Protection Engineering. We're out of Wilmington, North Carolina, also offices down in Florida. I've been involved in this project since we did the first feasibility study. I guess it's been about 10 years now. Back in 2012 is when we first did the feasibility study. Was very much involved in the 2017 project, and been very much involved in the monitoring of this project and now the design of the second project. Adam Priest up here in the front row. He's also with Coastal Planning or Coastal Protection Engineering. He's also in our office down in Wilmington, but he and I have kind of tag teamed this in terms of design concepts and putting this stuff together and looking at the monitoring data. So he too is very much familiar with this program. And then two folks that we don't have with us today, but you'll probably be seeing a lot of over the summer and into the fall. Two of the guys that work underneath Adam and I, field inspectors that will be up here. That's Sam Lohman and Frank Marshall. So we'll bring them by before things get started up in Duck, so that staff is comfortable working with them. But certainly Adam and I will be watching this very closely, and at least one of us will be up here probably weekly. With Weeks Marine today, we've got James Ferguson here, all the way over there on your right. He's the project manager for this project, so he's come off another big project that he's been working on, but for the last month or so has been wrapping his head around all of the details and the specs and things like that, so getting a pretty good handle on things. And then Joe Mazzarella, also, he's the operations manager, so they're both up here putting their heads into this week. I think they're going to be up here next week as well, but things are starting to come together really well. All right, so like I said, here's the outline. We'll talk about background, talk about the design, a little bit about the borrow area, and then we'll get into those construction photos. And I'm comfortable taking questions as we go. If I just kept talking, it'd probably take me 25 or 30 minutes to get through these slides. But if something pops up, I'm happy to take questions, from council or from the public. So keep this kind of informal, if you will. But general overview, this is the overview map that we show often. The town of Duck, this project's very important to you all, but it's part of a much larger project that includes your neighbors to the south, Southern Shores, Kitty Hawk, and Kildable Hills. But just looking at that map, one thing that pops out about the Duck project is that it kind of sits up there alone. Even though it's part of the whole contract, it's that 1.6 mile project that we're trying to get optimized, that's just north of the field research facility. And then we've got a bit of a gap before we get into this much longer project that's contiguous of Southern Shores, Kitty Hawk, and Kildable Hills. And then for a frame of reference, you also see that green polygon out there in the ocean. That would be the borrow site, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. That'll be the source for the sand for all four projects. That fine print down the bottom says approximately 12.1 miles of shoreline in northern Dare will be renourished, about 2.64 million cubic yards of sand. All right. So keeping with this background, I showed a very similar slide at the retreat back in February, but for those of you that weren't there or hadn't tuned in for that, in general, there are a couple of things that we like to keep in mind when we're designing this project or when we're looking at trying to improve the performance of this project. And those are the original established goals. So when the town of Duck first started getting into this idea of beach nourishment, everybody says, like, do I need beach nourishment? Is this necessary? And beach nourishment does a lot of things for a lot of different communities. So you've kind of got to define, well, what are you trying to accomplish? And then if we know those goals, then we can say, do you need beach nourishment? How much do you need? Where do you need it? So early on, we established a goal of a long-term program to sustain the beaches that support a significant portion of the local economy and maintain the tax base of the town. And in order to do that, we've designed a program that would maintain the oceanfront beach and the dune to a configuration that does three things. So that would be provide a reasonable level of storm damage reduction. When a storm happens, we don't want houses to fall into the ocean. We have a specific design storm. So if that design storm hits or something lesser than that, that beach should stay in place to the point where it's providing that level of protection. And anything bigger than that, it would be a reduction in damages that would have otherwise happened. Mitigating for long-term erosion, so this erosion that we see happening year after year, keeping up with that rate of loss that we know we have. In general, there's always some sort of sediment budget. The region of the country that we live in here in North Carolina, we have a very wide coastal plain that includes, the Pamlico and the Albemarle Sound. But then once you get on land, eastern North Carolina is very flat until you get up into the hilly regions, and that whole stretch of area is the coastal plain. So any sediment that comes out of the higher elevations will settle across that coastal plain before it makes its way all the way out here to the coast. So we don't have a big influx of new sand like the Mississippi River or the Columbia River. We're basically stuck with what geological time has given us in eastern North Carolina, and we're dealing with wave forces that are constantly moving that sand plus some sea level rise. So keeping up with that long-term erosion. And then finally, maintaining a healthy beach that supports valuable shorebirds and sea turtle nesting habitat. So when we design these beaches, that's what we're trying to achieve. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this design. And council, you guys that have seen my presentations before, you know that I wouldn't probably go through a presentation without showing this graphic, but it's going on YouTube today. Probably some people that haven't seen this before, and it's a really handy graphic that shows people how in general these things are supposed to work. So you've got your before any kind of a beach project has gone in profile here, but when we add that beach or when we complete that construction, we've built a dune and we've built a very wide dry sand beach out here that at some point in time will slope down on a 1:15 slope into the water. But all of that sand is placed there during construction, but it's placed there with the understanding that some of that sand is going to migrate off of the constructed beach and out into deeper water over the course of what might be, 6 months to 18 months, probably happen faster than 18 months up here on the Outer Banks. But once these wave forces start interacting with that sand, it's going to move some of that sand out to renourish the outer part of the beach. So that's troubling to people that aren't familiar with how these projects are supposed to work, because they say, we just built this huge wide beach and 6 months later it's only half as wide. You guys wasted all of our money. But this is part of the design. And so this slide here shows in particular the red arrows pointing to the volume of sand both up on the beach, this dune and this dry sand berm, and some of the sand that's offshore. This is the amount of sand that we've determined needs to be in place all the time to provide a specific level of protection. So if the design storm were to hit, that's the amount of sand that you need in place to provide the protection we designed for. But we know once that sand is out there, that every storm that comes through is going to take a little bit of sand with it. So we estimate how much sand over the course of whatever your renourishment interval is. Here we're working with 5 years. We estimate how much sand might we lose over 5 years, and we put that sand in front of our design so that not only do we have our design in place on day one, but we also have our design in place all the way after 5 years when Weeks Marine shows back up and come to put sand on the beach, okay? That's the way the system is supposed to work. So after that period of time, ideally you'd be left with your design, and at that point in time, it would be time for renourishment. But now, the second project, all we're replacing is that sacrificial sand, that advanced fill that we put out there. Ideally, we're not reconstructing the original design that was placed out there, all right? So that's where we're getting into now. We're getting into that first renourishment cycle. This is kind of showing the same thing, but these are actual beach profiles that were done for another project. So this is showing the black line here that kind of goes under this red box is the existing profile before construction. This is the template that was designed. This yellow sand is showing what was actually constructed during the project. And then if we went back and resurveyed that area about 18 months later, this is what the profile looked like. So this is a pretty classic profile that just illustrates in real data what that equilibration looks like. And one of the things that we try to point out to people, again, somebody will say, you know, what good is that sand doing me when it's way out there in the ocean and I can't set my towel on it. I can't sit up here and you know, rest on it or what have you, read my book. But the thing to remember about this is that when these waves approach during a storm event, I lost my pointer, keep losing it. When these waves approach during a storm event, a wave of any particular height is going to break in a certain depth of water, okay? So you see these movies where these giant waves come in and shore and, you know, sweep over New York City. It doesn't happen that way. The wave would collapse on itself in some depth of water before it's able to come all the way in like that. So if we have a wave, in this particular instance, prior to the project being built, that wave would have broken right here where the depth of water is, you know, whatever this is on the sheet, 6 feet of water or something like that. Whereas after the project, that sand has moved offshore. Now we've moved that point to where that big wave is going to break, you know, 150 or 200 feet further offshore. So we've dissipated that energy, and some of that, you know, the wave may reform, but the wave that reforms closer to shore that actually comes up onto the sand is much smaller because the big wave broke offshore. All right, so that's a big driving point that we want to try to make sure that folks understand why it is important to have that sand in the offshore. All right, so one more thing that I want to talk about, because I'm about to get into the details of this particular project and how we came up with the volume that we're going to end up placing on the beach here in the next several months. Remember this concept of we have a design amount of volume and we have an advanced fill amount of volume. And that advanced fill is an estimate of how fast we think the sand is going to erode off the beach. The very first time we built this project, we assumed a rate of loss for this project of about 6 cubic yards per linear foot. The monitoring data that we have to date shows that the project lost more like 11.9, close to 12 cubic yards per linear foot, okay? So almost twice the amount of volume. And so a lot of the effort that we did going into this next renourishment is, are there things that we can do in terms of configuring the fill that slow that rate down to something closer to what it had been previously? Now, historically, these projects, the more times you build, the first time you build a project like this, that shore face out there just below the water has really been sand starved for a certain period of time. You've got these houses on the beach, and you know, when there's nothing on the beach, all these forces are at work. But once you build that house, you know, there's a point where we're trying to maintain the shoreline in a certain area. And as people are doing different things to try to maintain that position, that offshore kind of gets a little steeper, becomes more sand starved. So the first time we put this sand out there, it's sort of reshuffling the deck. And the more times you add sand to that system, the more you're getting closer to where it was when the system was functioning naturally, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And so it takes several cycles to go through that process before you've really smoothed it out. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing rates that are, closer to 11 or 12 cubic yards per foot as opposed to the 6 cubic yards that were predicted.
Ken, could
yes,
I
ma'am.
just interrupt you? Because I think I hear where you're going. I mean, the point you're making here is that the design or the advanced fill wasn't sufficient over the last 5 years since the project started because of different forces,
Correct.
But just as comparison-wise, your calculations for the Kitty Hawk and Kill Devil Hills projects did perform within your estimates. Is that correct?
So the Kill Devil Hills project performed better than anticipated, and the Kitty Hawk project performed, I think, we were also anticipating 6 cubic yards there. I think we were closer to just over 7 cubic yards or 7.5, so a little bit higher in Kitty Hawk, but less than we anticipated in Kill Devil Hills. So there is some variability. And again, that first picture that we showed with that Town of Duck project kind of sitting up there by itself, we knew going in that there would be some challenges. So in terms of that idea of advanced fill versus the design fill, now we've got this graph and it looks kind of complicated, but what we're looking at is this is a point in time somewhere around 2013, and we're just going to call that the 0 point. So no matter whether sand was gained or sand was lost, that's the amount of sand that was in place back in 2013 when we did the first beach profile survey for the Town of Duck. So everything along this green line until you get to this big jump was prior to the project going in, okay? So before the project, it went down a little bit, it came up a little bit, but we're still kind of staying where we were in 2013. In 2017, we build the project. We add all of this volume to get to this point. This is cumulative volume as we go. So now we're up here, we're about 1 million cubic yards greater than our 0 point that was in 2013, all right? So this black line that runs across the screen here, think of that in terms of when I'm above that line, I have all of my design sand, the red arrows in that previous slide. I have all my design sand, and whatever is above that is really my advanced fill, okay? So after year one, keep losing that pointer. After year one, we see a drop off. After year two, we see a drop off, and we're getting pretty close to that design. This next drop is actually Hurricane Dorian. Drops us down pretty low, but following Hurricane Dorian, we did have some rebound. So 2.5, 3 years after the project was constructed, we're pretty close to that design level. So if you say we're losing sand twice as fast as we thought we were going to have a 5-year nourishment interval, and 2.5 years into the project, we're down to our design. That math works pretty well. So now we go from 2020 to 2021. And we're below our line. And so now what we've done is we've said, okay, the rate that we've been losing sand from the time it was built to the last survey that we had in 2021, we can determine a rate for that. And we're going to say between 2021 and the time the project goes in, we're going to lose sand at that same rate. That's a prediction that was made, okay? And then we're going to add a certain amount of sand, and then we're going to assume that same rate of loss throughout 5 years. And so the end point of this is basically showing where we would be in relation to that original design after this next nourishment cycle, and trying to make some predictions of that, okay? So the ideal situation would be come in and we know that let's anticipate we're losing at 12 cubic yards per foot. Let's figure out how much sand we are in a deficit below the design. Let's add all that sand to the project so that at the end of 5 years, now we do have that design. Well, we ran the numbers on that, and it was going to drive the price of the project up 70%, something like that, but considerable. So we started looking at the actual budget for the project, and then We also, after the bids came in, we were able to adjust this line a little bit more. But this is basically where we believe we would stand now. So this line up to this red point represents the amount of fill that's in the contract for Weeks Marine. And then all of these points are predictions, and we'll monitor that to see how we end up at the end of the day. Ideally, the design that's intended to slow that erosion rate down over the next 5 years, we'll see those points come up every time we do a survey. And the first data point that we'll get will actually be this data point right here, which we should get in the next couple of months when Weeks Marine does their pre-construction survey. So we'll see how that compares to the rate that we've seen since the project was constructed. It could be a little high, could be a little low. But again, that's a data point that'll help us keep track of this trend. So it takes a little bit of time to explain, but once you've wrapped your head around that design and advanced fill concept, it makes a little bit more sense of how we're trying to deal with these numbers. So in general, the project design, things that we're considering, obviously the town's projected project budget, the level of success of the project at achieving project goals of reducing storm damage. So how well is that project done in terms of reducing damage during storms? And we also want to look at fill configurations that would actually slow that those erosion losses, try to reduce that rate down from that 11.9 cubic yards. So the actual nourishment design is looking at optimizing, originally it was looking at optimizing beach fill configuration of 425,000 cubic yards. That number was determined based on the original assumption of how much money we thought the renourishment would cost, plus the amount of funds that we're getting from the Hurricane Dorian FEMA damages. So when you add those volumes together, we get to 425. That was the original number that we started working on in terms of optimizing a design. So that, again, that assumed that rate of loss of about 11.9 cubic yards per foot per year. And then we were looking to, the first thing that we did in terms of, so we're going to place a certain amount of sand along the entire beach, but we're not placing the exact same amount of sand at every profile down the beach. So how do we determine who needs what? Well, the very first thing that we want to do is go in there, and based on our latest survey, we want to say, are there profiles where that design fill is actually in place? On average, we know it's not, but are there places that it is in place? If it is in place, or it's just a little below that, we're only going to add that much sand there to get it back to the design. All right, in other places that has chewed into the design quite a bit, like on the south end, we may be adding a higher fill density. And then at that point in time, once we've reestablished that design, it would take 192,500 cubic yards to reestablish that design. Then the balance of that would be uniformly distributed at around 25.2 cubic yards per foot of fill along the project area. So this bullet item is kind of variable. This bullet item is uniform, and that's how you end up with these discrepancies of some areas get a little bit more. There are also tapers on either side of the project. A taper is basically meant to slow the losses of sand off of the ends of these projects. On the north end, it extends 500 feet, and I'll show you a plan view drawing here in just a second that'll illustrate that. But on the south end, we don't have the ability of building a 500-foot taper into the field research facility's property. So we compute how much volume we would have needed to build that taper, and we spread it along the portion of the project about from the north end of North Snow Geese south to the end of the project limit. So I think we determined something like 25,000 cubic yards would be needed to build that taper. We pile all that extra sand from North Snow Geese down to the end of the project area to help form kind of a natural taper over time. And then after that was using that 425,000 cubic yards. After the project was bid, and we submitted a bid that everybody was very, very much pleased with, we were able to go in and add an additional 69,000 cubic yards to bolster this design above and beyond what we had originally anticipated. And so where to place that 69,000 was determined based on a bunch of numerical modeling that we had done. We had looked at different options of placing sand in different parts of the town and trying to keep as much sand in the project area as possible. And what that modeling showed us is that it would be preferential to place that additional sand between, last time I didn't have these, I had stations and not roads, so this time we got roads. It's between Pintail Drive and Seaturn Drive. Between those two areas is where that additional sand would be spread. So if we put all of that volume together, and this time around, there won't be any construction of dunes the way there was back in 2017. So everything that we're going to build in the town of Duck will be a flat sand beach that ties into an elevation of +6 feet. But on average, the beach width, when we build that, will be about, we computed it would be about 119 feet on average wide once construction is done. Now again, some of that sand is going to move offshore to renourish to offshore, but in terms of how wide that beach will be on average, and it varies as you go up and down the beach, is about 119 feet. Now, you see a little asterisk, maybe, it's kind of fine print next to that 119. The reason we put that on this slide is to remind me to say that this 119 is actually based on the original plans that were bid out to Weeks Marine. But since then, we've added 69,000 cubic yards more. We've added it to the price, but without new survey data, we haven't taken the time to lay that design out and figure out what that new average is. So that average will go up from 119-foot average in terms of construction. Yes, ma'am.
When you said that you weren't doing anything to the dunes, are you concerned that the height of the dune that's been escarped is going to be a problem butting up against the flat beach?
So what another part of the design is to place sand fencing at the base of the dune. So what we would anticipate with once that dry sand beach is there and you get that first winter coming in with the blowing of the sand, that we're going to use the forces of nature to kind of reestablish the bottom portion of the dune. Okay. We believe that, I don't know, Sandy, if it's one row of sand fencing that's in their contract, but I mean, there's the ability to add sand fencing as we see how that works.
There is one full row of sand fencing that's going to be installed by Weeks Marine, and I believe we are putting in the budget a request for a second row to supplement.
Okay. Yes. Oh.
The 2017 project, how many cubic yards of sand is going to be?
It was about 1 million cubic yards, but in terms of this particular graphic, something that might help understand. So we're talking about widening the beach, probably something a little bit greater than 120 feet wide. So if you went down to the wet dry line today, that wet dry line, when they're finished pumping, will be about 120, 130 feet further out into the water. The original project pushed that line out about 240 feet. So if you were standing on the water line before the project went in, that 2017 project widened the beach about 240 feet on average.
Having much sand this time is another 5 years.
Correct. But if we, one of the things that's in the town's monitoring report is every year when we do this monitoring, we talk about what percentage of the sand that was placed there back in 2017 is still in place. There's 50% of the sand that was placed during that 2017 project still in place today.
The ocean floor is much better than the Canadian one.
The ocean floor.
Going down in the ocean, you can wait a long ways.
Gotcha. Yep.
Before 10, 15 feet.
Yep. And that goes to that one slide that I showed that shows those breaking waves. I mean, every time there was a storm in the first couple of years, we would always click on the FRF's website that has like the cameras up there to just see what it looks like. And it's always nice to see all of that white out in front of the town of Duck. The sea is a mess, But all of that wave energy is being broken up out there where you're talking about you can wade out to. It's not all coming right up and crashing on and chewing up the dune. So, yeah, anytime you can see that breaker line out there, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. All right, so I talked about a little bit the plan views. So this, and I'll zoom into these in just a second, but in general, if we looked at the whole entire project area, you can see that this gray band, which represents the thickness of the sand that's being placed out there, it gets narrow and it gets wide. And again, that's because we're trying to reestablish that design, step number one, spread everything out, the balance of the fill out evenly, number two, place the sand that would have gone south of the project in the taper along that southern end from North Snowgeese down south. And then we're going to take another 69,000 cubic yards and pile it up between those two red lines that are shown on the map. So at the end of the day, it does not look like an even ribbon of sand all the way down the beach. There's variability. Now, you're not going to see that variability when you're walking down the beach, but in terms of looking at actual stations and distances and volumes that are going on, that those numbers do vary as we go through it. So here are a couple of zoom-ins. I think I've got 3 of these that kind of just show the zoomed-in plan. But again, this is the section from the northern end of North Snowgeese south. This area is a little bit fatter. That's because that's where that additional volume for the taper is located. And in terms of these different numbers, the town has access to these plan drawings. They may be on the internet. But in terms of trying to understand this, so these are the plan views. There are also cross sections on different sheets. But the line that is the most landward line that says landward berm crest. So this is the point where the sand will actually start to be built out. So I mentioned earlier, all we're doing this time around is building a flat sand beach. The elevation of that flat sand beach is at plus 6 foot elevation, so about 6 feet above the water line. That's the same elevation that the flat sand beach was built during the 2017 project. So lots of pictures, we'll show some pictures, but that flat sand beach where they were working and the pipes are all stacked up, all their equipment, that's at plus 6 foot elevation. But in order to figure out where the new sand is actually going to be placed, they will literally have surveyors out there figuring out where that 6 foot contour is. And in general, if you were out there walking on the beach and you saw the wet dry line, that line in the sand that the waves are moving up and kind of stopping, the 6 foot contour is probably just a few steps further up on the beach than where that wet dry line is. So think of that wet dry line in general as where the sand will start to be pushed out. But there will be a gap between the toe of the dune and where that flat sand beach starts. So part of the beach will kind of have that natural slope, if you will, in some locations. So it will be a little bit different than the 2017 project. We won't see those dunes being pushed up throughout the project.
Ken, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
No problem.
when you talk about the wet, dry, does it matter if it's high or low tide to you? I mean, what are you looking at?
Yeah, I mean, that line is going to change, but and it also depends on how big the waves are. But in general, if you can think of where that wet dry line is, and go another 10 or 15 feet up the beach, that you're probably getting pretty close to that. Probably getting pretty close.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
How far, this might be for you, Sandy, I'm not sure who's making this determination. How far north is the beach, is the sand fencing going to go in the taper area?
Yes, it won't go beyond the nourishment area.
That's a good question. Well, I'll have to check to see what those quantities are in terms of, and there's probably some discretion we can talk about, what that exact number, because the number that's in the bid document is probably an estimate. It's probably a rounder number than the exact number of it, but we could talk about whether it should be all the way through the taper or stop at where the design beach did. Do you know in the first project in 2017, did you guys go all the way up through the taper?
Yeah, you do sand fencing.
No, we did do sand fencing. We did the sand fencing in the nourishment, but not going beyond the taper, ends up being 752 sections, which is the total linear foot,
Divided by
less 10% to allow for accesses, and
In that the southern area.
In the southern area.
Yeah.
Okay, not-
Yeah. The northern area, that fill is a little bit thinner on the north, so the taper that goes north is probably less than 25,000. It might be closer to 10,000, just because you're tapering out. If on the south end the fill is this wide, you have to taper down to the existing beach this wide. But on the north end, if it's only this wide, you're only tapering down from that distance. So the northern taper volume is less than the southern taper volume, but it still goes the same distance. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I live on North Snokies, and I want to try to summarize what you said, so I want to repeat it to the other people on our street. I know I got it right. So the dune will not change. The dune will be what the dune is today.
That is correct. So the bulldozers and everything out there will not be changing the configuration of that dune. Right, and the idea is to install that sand fencing and see that natural buildup of the sand. Go ahead.
But I do want to clarify, Roberta, and to the audience, that you still have the dune that was constructed.
Right.
So the dune, before you had no dune, in 2017, a 20-foot wide, 20-foot tall dune was constructed. That is still there, as evidenced by the sand fencing that was installed. There's one row of sand fencing left. That sand fencing was placed at the eastern edge of that dune that was constructed before soil.
Okay, so that's the first part. The second part is the beach will be half the size that it was after the last project.
So again, some of the sand is still there from the last project. So it would be hard to, it'd be hard to kind of compare. Right. But it will not, right, it would, I mean, if you were taking steps from the base of the dune out to the water line, it will be less steps to get out there.
And the sand is the only thing my neighbors care about is how they get to the beach.
I have a question. So if we're not constructing a dune to the level that we did in 2017, there are areas that this crowd certainly knows has a dune height of probably 20 to 22 feet because we've built up since the 2017 Nourishment. We now have a scarp that is in some places 10 feet, maybe 12 feet. So if we're building to an elevation of 6, that's still going to leave a scarp of potentially 6 feet. Do you think that the placement of the sand fencing is going to help to eliminate that scarp? And will people still be able to, or will sand be placed such that they can walk down from their 20-foot high dune to the berm
So,
versus use the steps?
Right.
Sorry, loaded question.
so the way the project is
Did I cover everything you guys were thinking?
The way the project's designed is no sand would be mechanically placed above the plus 6 foot contour. So in terms of like augmenting the dune or changing that slope, the only change in the slope would happen with the installation of the sand fencing and going from a sheer drop off to something that's that's more rounded as that sand kind of stacks in against that scarp and builds up around the sand fencing.
Doesn't sound like an answer.
It's going to be hard to get down.
On South Snokies.
Okay.
And that's where we have at least a 10-foot scarf down. So if the sand fencing goes where the new beach is, I don't understand what's going to protect the scarf and how we traverse from 20 feet up.
Okay.
Yeah.
The sand fencing by permit has to be placed within 10 feet of the base of the scarp. So the base of the dune, that's where the sand fencing has to be placed. It won't be placed, the mechanical placement of the sand will be out from the 6 foot contour going out. But the sand fence, and I've got a picture coming up that'll explain this a little bit better, but the sand fencing will be right up against the dune. It'll be stacked on those angles right at the base of the scarp, at the base of the dune. And that's where we're anticipating that blown sand to start filling in those areas. Does that make sense?
Maybe we could make some sand fencing like this, and then we could just have people go down the sand fencing.
Hang on.
The sand fencing will be up against the scarf, or it will be 10 feet away from the scarf?
Base of the
It has to be within 10 feet. It can't be 10 feet away from it. I'm going to fast forward through some stuff because I've got a picture that's going to show. So the sand fencing, what we're trying to show here is that this, in general, this is, hand drawn, trying to guess where that plus 6 foot contour is. In this particular area, it may be somewhere around here. So the beach gets built out from this location out towards the ocean. But in this red zone here, that's likely where that sand fencing would be placed. And even it can be placed. There's some discretion as to where it would be placed. It could be, depending on what it looks like at the time. And we're still several months away from this. You guys know how fast conditions change, whether it's scarped or whether it kind of looks more rounded as it looks in this picture. We will make the determination at the point in time when they're finishing construction as to where exactly to place that sand fence. But by permit, we could go from the toe of the dune out as far as 10 feet. It would have to be in that 10-foot spacing. But you could place it on the face of this little mound there.
But I think the question is, how do they get from the top of the dune down?
Well, I think the answer to it is each of those accesses within the nourishment area is going to be graded, right?
Well, that's actually in the process right now.
Right.
So, again, as Ken said, we know the beach is very dynamic. It changes daily. All of you council members typically go down to the beach. You know what it looks like one day. The next day, you have a pile of sand. You're like, oh, where did that come from? A lot of times, sand fencing, we will accumulate 4 feet of sand fill. If you look at the sand fencing that's still left from the 2017 Nourishment, most of it is covered. So it's accumulated 4 feet. Now, do we have a definitive answer as to whether people will need steps or whether they will continue to be able to walk? I don't think we can answer that at this point. In 2017, we knew people could walk, and we tried to maintain that walkability for the past 5 years. That may change after this. If we do the beach fill and there's still a 4 foot drop off, then probably need steps. If we do the beach fill and as things change and sand blows, it's walkable, then we will probably recommend that they continue to be walkable versus structures. Structures, as you can see, even with the sand fencing, can cause damage to the dune. When we have storms, and I start seeing sand fencing derelict like that hanging on the side of the scarp, we pay somebody to go remove it, because every time we get a storm or we have wind blowing, that sand fencing is going like this, and it's knocking out the sand. So, these are things that we're going to be thinking about. I feel your pain. I know exactly what you're talking about, because I can see your steps are actually showing up.
Their steps are
Okay, but yours are not far behind.
well, but the problem with ours is they go down in bed, so ours going down, so we're gonna have a major problem.
There's going to be some situations that we'll have to be looking at closely as this happens. I think in April, 5 months before this happens, how a little too premature to jump to conclusions.
Well, I just think that it's not going to be good if we spend millions of dollars to preserve a beach that people can't get to.
I don't think anybody disagrees with that.
Right.
And I would just suggest that, first of all, as you always are, but you need to be very agile about what you allow us to do when the time comes. And I would seriously ask you to reconsider making us take out the post and rope if they're not going to go anywhere near that part of the dune.
So Roberta said she wants us to be very agile in what we allow.
You really have to take out the post and rope if they're not going to go anywhere near that part of the dune.
So you don't want to have to do that if they're not going to go close. That's a legitimate request. If they're not going to be getting right up on the dune and there's post and rail and post and rope situations, they would like to be able to keep them there. And I think that's reasonable. And I'm sorry, I'm repeating Roberta because I'm not loud enough.
Nobody's ever told me that before.
Sure, that's a good question. Yes, for sure. The question was, I had mentioned a design storm a couple of times, and the question was, is that like a Category 1 hurricane? Is that a Category 2 hurricane? A lot of times when you get into these engineering analysis, you start to look at a storm that has the potential statistically of appearing every 5 years, or a 10-year storm, or sometimes you hear about the 100-year storm. So all of these are, you use past data, and you're trying to figure out statistically of what's the chances on any given year. A storm that has a 1% chance of happening any year is a 100-year storm, but you could have 300-year storms in 10 years. It's just on any given year you have a 1% chance of it. And it's difficult for people to kind of grasp that concept. And so the Corps of Engineers uses this terminology a lot, and lots of different design specifications would use this method. But when we first started looking at this project, and we started juggling potential budgets with what the county was able to pay and what would be reasonable for the towns to pay, we had looked at a statistical analysis of saying, what's the 20-year storm, what's a 25, what's a 50-year storm, and what we found was that the affordability of what would be a reasonable level of protection was probably in the 20 to 30-year storm range. And when we looked at Hurricane Isabel, which people are really familiar with, we found that it had a lot of the same characteristics of a 20 or 30-year storm. Now, does that mean it had a wave height or a wave period or water levels? Those are all different characteristics that you could come up and compute a 30-year statistic for a wave height or a wave period or a water level. But in general, that Hurricane Isabel storm that people in the area were pretty familiar with, the type of damages that occurred, was in that range of what the budget would have allowed for. So from that point forward, instead of saying we're designing to a 20 or 30-year storm, we specifically simulate what the wave forces were and the water levels were during Hurricane Isabel to figure out what the design level of protection is needed. And over time, that storm hit in 2003. Over time, we just continue to increase the water level. So if the high water mark during Hurricane Isabel was 10 feet, and we've seen half a foot of sea level rise or a quarter foot of sea level rise or whatever, we're adjusting those water levels as we go further and further into the future. But using that storm as sort of a proxy of what's probably a reasonable level of protection in terms of what the communities up here in Dare County could afford and what folks are comfortable with. And then anything that would exceed that storm, there's clearly protection there, but whether or not every house would still be standing, that's how we've got into the storm.
Was Isabel a 1 or 2? 3?
I can actually speak to that.
I don't remember what it was.
Hurricane Isabel was approaching the coast as a Category 4 and downgraded to a Category 1 shortly before impact.
But the wave forces, one of the things about Hurricane Isabel is the duration of that storm. The storm stayed offshore for a long period of time, and it impacted the coast for a repeated period of time. So when we simulate that, and I think there might have been a storm that came through the week before or something, but I know that when we do that storm simulation, it's a long period of time. It's not like a 12-hour period or a 24-hour period. It's an extended period of time with everything that came along before and after that storm. So. Yes, ma'am.
And why do you think the calculation that was made where we were anticipated to lose 6 cubic feet actually resulted in 11 cubic feet? And what was Dorian the cause of that? And
I mean, Dorian took some sand, but we saw some rebound after Dorian as well. I don't think you could point to that being the particular culprit. I think that the fact that we're not able to build a taper the way that we'd like to build a taper on the south end, and that sand is kind of, we're already dealing with a short project, and then we're handcuffed by not being able to design and construct a taper on the south end into the FRF. That has probably sped up some of the end losses, and we see the losses being higher in the south end than they are in the northern part of the project. So I think those are kind of the main reasons why we're seeing higher rates, and those are also the things that we've focused on in the numerical modeling to try to figure out how can we actually, how can we lessen that through this next cycle. It's a good question. All right, so these are just those plan views. Want to point out a couple of things. These are construction accesses that were identified through the permitting process. So this is at the end of quarter deck. There is the ability of access there, but in terms of bringing through heavy equipment, that access isn't large enough, to mobilize everything through that access. So most likely, we'll let the guys from Weeks talk about this a little bit here in a minute, but most likely what will happen is all of the equipment that will be used to build Kildable Hills and Kitty Hawk and Southern Shores will migrate up the beach and not necessarily. Before the previous project, Duck was the first one, everything came through the field research facility property. Most of the equipment that will be used to build the beach will probably stay on the beach and come, from south, and then after the project, it'll go back south. All right, and then this is showing that through. These are cross sections. I'm going to try to jump ahead a little bit. Real quick in terms of the sand source. So people are concerned with, are you going to put sand on the beach that, does it have a lot of rock? Does it have a lot of shell? Is it going to be dark? Is it going to be the same? A lot of work goes into determining whether the sand in these borrow sites is compatible. That's why in this particular area, we're 15 miles away from the actual location for Duck. The best sand that we've been able to find with a lot of different efforts of surveys and vibrocores and things like that is that source that's just offshore of the southern end of Kildable Hills. So if you were to take a boat or a jet ski or something and go right off the shore at Kildable Hills, you'd have to go about 5 miles out to get to this point. You'd have to go about 6.5 miles out to get to this point. But there's about 12 million cubic yards of sand that's mapped in that area. If you went out there and rode over it in a fish finder, it's about 50 to 60 feet of water. One thing, when we put that range of 50 to 60 feet of water, don't think of it out there as like a flat surface to where the dredge is out there digging a hole. What really exists out there is there's a shoal, there's a mound of sand out there, and the dredges are actually trimming the top of that mound of sand out. And we'll show that to you in a cross section here in just a second. So
Ken, what happened to the sand-off Duck?
The sand-off Duck, so in the 2017 project, there was a borrow area that was directly offshore of Duck, but most of the sand that was in there was used during that 2017. So in terms of what was actually permitted and the depths that they're allowed to dig out there, there may be a little bit of sand out there, but it's not economical to try to harvest or try to retrieve that little bit of sand that's out there. And it was a little bit finer grained, if you'll remember. We ended up mixing it with some of the sand from the other borrow site. But a lot of geophysical surveys go into that. A lot of core samples have been taken out there. There's huge reports that if anybody were interested, there's a lot of rigorous effort. The state has specific rules of how dense the surveying needs to be to determine compatibility. So at the end of the day, this is kind of the shape that we end up with in terms of where that dredge has to stay inside of all these lines. And in each one of these boxes, there's actually a different elevation that they can cut to. Now, these boxes are really, really big. These dredges are big. They don't turn on a dime. So there's some work that goes into how to design these to make sure that they can be efficiently dredged by these big ships. But in general, in order to try to maximize the amount of sand in this area, we've designed several different cuts. So each one of these boxes represents a different level that they could dredge down to. And this shows it a little bit better in cross section. So if you went all the way from the northern part of the borrow area to the southern part of the borrow area, you can see that there's kind of a stair step in the bottom of this, but you also see that the surface, the sea floor, isn't a flat surface. This is the highest point, so we could potentially take this sand that's on top of this upper level, but as you move down in these stair steps, the elevation of the sea floor is actually going down as well. And so there are a number of different shoals out there on top of shoals, and that's how that borrow area is designed. All right, so let's look at some construction photos. For folks that aren't familiar with how these projects are built, some of the first action that you might see on the beach, other than maybe some pipes being delivered, is crews working offshore. They're installing the line that will eventually go from the dredge that's self-propelled, that goes out 15 miles down the beach, digs up a load of sand and brings it back up just offshore of the town of Duck. Well, there's a pump out station that it has to hook up to, and then there's a submerged line that lays on the ocean floor and comes up onto the beach as shown here. And then the bulldozers and some vessels that are just offshore will work together in tandem to get that pipeline up on the beach. Once that pipeline is in place and the dredge is ready to start working, they'll hook up offshore, just offshore where we can see in this picture, and they'll start pumping that sand from the ship onto the beach to try to create what they would call a pad, like a flat area that they can start working off of. Once that pad is built, then they can start turning that pipe. So this is the pipe that goes way offshore to where the dredge is pumping out, comes up and turns in either direction, and then they split that line with a valve, and they can work off of either one of these lines at any given time. Excuse me. So this is kind of a nice schematic that we had, labeled everything. So there is fencing, there's construction fencing along the sides of this construction area, all the way down to where the discharge would be. There's another fence down here. It's a little hard to see from this angle, but that would be the area that we would call the active construction area. This is the area that we would keep pedestrians out of all the time. But that area is constantly moving. So once they get this part of the beach built, they just continue to add pipe on as they go, and this beach would open up, and they'll be working, further to the south in this picture. So this is another shot that kind of shows the layout of the different equipment that they might have in that area. This is just a short video from the drone that shows kind of what you would see. Not too exciting, but you've got the slurry, the mix of sand and water coming out of this particular pipe here, and these bulldozers, as the water is running into the back into the ocean, that sand falls out of suspension, and these operators are stacking it up to create that flat sand beach that all this equipment is built on top of. So this is that flat, dry sand beach that we were talking about. So if the water line was back here before the project went in, this flat sand beach will be 120, 130 feet wide from that point somewhere up there where that starting point is. All right, those are all pictures from the 2017 project. Next. All right, so this is from up on the dune, just kind of showing the type of equipment that you might see out there. Water tanks, some of the foreman pickup trucks, things like that. Light plants that they use in the evening to light up the construction area. Bulldozers, porta-johns, these Connex boxes that they'll use as office spaces and things like that. Fuel tanks, that sort of thing. But all of that is confined in that construction area, and it moves along. We talked about in one of the other towns, it kind of operates like an inchworm. Like in the beginning, in the morning, they try to extend that out as far as they might be discharging, and throughout the day, they bring up the back end as they can condense everything. Then the next day, they stretch it out and they condense. But it's constantly moving as long as the dredges are operating. It's constantly moving down the beach. Yes, ma'am. Do you want me to go back to that last picture?
Okay, so I'm trying to understand what's the period of time that active construction zone is closed. My property's primarily a business. I have renters.
Sure.
I'm trying to anticipate how big of an issue this will be. It looks like it's a pretty wide space where they can't get to that beach. And where do they go, and how long are they kept off?
Sure, that's a great question. So typically that area is probably, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but somewhere between 600 and 1,000. I think our specs actually say that it can't be more than 1,000 foot of an area, so we're trying to keep them somewhat compact. But there's a lot of equipment out there, and we safety is a big concern. We're trying to keep people out of that area. But between 600 and 1,000 feet. Typically what we were saying previously was on average, it's about 3 days between the time that, if your property was here, that fence moves in front of your property, and on that particular day, you might only have to walk down 2 houses to get on the beach. But the next morning when you wake up, that fence might be down here a little, and now you got to walk a couple hundred feet. But after about 3 days on average, that construction area has moved to where now you can walk this way just a house or two and be back out on the beach. So on average, we like to tell people 3 days. This project, somebody pointed out in the audience last night at Kitty Hawk, the fact that those were the averages for the last project. All of the fill densities for these projects are less than the projects were the first go round. So in theory, the equipment is different. You know, each dredge has a capacity of pumping a little bit faster, the number of dredges that you have on a particular line. But, you know, just looking at the volume of sand, there may be times where they're moving a little bit faster, but there may be times where weather comes up, and usually what will happen during that weather event, once they've done everything they can to get things situated, they'll try to contract that area as small as they can. If they're going to be down for 3 or 4 days because of weather, they're going to tighten that area up as much as possible, and maybe even allow people to walk, you know, between their house and the actual construction area. That's what this next picture was showing. So in the last project, we were constructing this dune the whole time. And so the way that the operation would work was at night, they would do all the pushing to create the dune, that big dry sand dune. And in the morning, they would put that barrier fence up along the top of the dune. And so as a renter or somebody came out, a vacationer came out, they could at least get up on top of that dune and, you know, see the ocean and see what was going on, and they were on the beach. And then they would have to walk either north or south along that area. But it wasn't like they couldn't go out of their walkway at that point in time. Now, depending on the condition of the dunes, and we've shown some pictures at some of the areas that are highly scarped, but we've talked a lot about this at the other towns. If there is room at the base of the dune to be able to create that barrier there on the backside of the construction site and still let people come down off of the dune and walk behind and keep people safely out of the construction area, that's something that they're amenable to. But the worst thing that could possibly happen on one of these projects is some kid sneaks under the fence and gets into the site, and something terrible happens. So the primary concern is always going to be safety, but they're well aware of the fact that they're working in a tourist environment, and they're trying to, you know, be good neighbors and minimize those inconveniences as much as possible. So, all right. But I mean, like, somebody's like, so you're promising that you're going to do this? I was like, no, we didn't promise anything. We said that once they're on site, they will evaluate, you know, how much room they have, how much room they need, you know, what the situation is at any given point on the beach, and if it's possible, then, you know, they'll try to do what they can to minimize the inconvenience. All right, so these are the 3 dredges that we was planning on bringing to the project site. The one on the top is the biggest dredge. This is actually larger than the large dredge that was on the 2017 project. That was a different company, but the Liberty Island does like 6 million cubic yards or something like this. This one's about 8 million cubic yards. 8,000. 6,000 versus 8,000. Thank you. That's a really big dredge. The bottom 2 dredges, see, are about 4,000. The last 3 presentations, I let James stand up and say all this, and this time I was like, I won't make him get up, and then I screwed it up. So I learned my lesson. But no, the first 2 dredges they anticipate bringing to the site are the bottom 2. As he just mentioned, they hold about 4,000 cubic yards. Probably won't get a full load on every go round, but you know, that's the capacity that's listed on the website, if you will. But they, you know, in terms of efficiency, they'll use those smaller dredges. They've created a schedule that allows those smaller dredges will become available first. They want to construct the projects that are closest to the borrow area with the little dredges. As they get further and further up to Southern Shores and Duck, they want to bring in that big dredge. It's much more efficient to make those long hauls. So I think their goal would be to build as much of the Duck project with the bigger dredge. But these are the 3 dredges we would anticipate seeing during the project. I talked about those pump out stations. So this is another video that we took during the last project. So this is a couple of thousand feet offshore. This dredge is hooked into that pipe. This is a floating pipe here, and then it goes to this buoy here, and the pipe goes down to the bottom. It goes from the seafloor up to the beach at that point in time, but the pumps on this boat are kind of recirculating the water, reslurrying that, and pumping it through that system. Let's see. Come on. All right, so we put these two pictures in here, just people that aren't familiar with what this looks like.
Ken?
Yes.
We have a question from the audience.
Okay.
And this may be probably a question for Weeks directly.
Okay.
Whether they plan on starting from the north end and working south, since that would be getting them back towards their finish point, or whether they're going to work from the south end to the north end.
You want to give them the mic?
Yes.
Right now, we have 2 pump out locations planned in Duck, and we would likely start on the south.
Where's the second? Where are the 2 locations?
They're not set in stone. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but the dredge is only able to pump a certain distance, so we would have to have at least 2. We couldn't do 1 station and then pump either way. The dredges don't have the ability to do that. So I know there will be 2. I don't know exactly where they will.
I'll try. Is that good?
Yeah,
Yep, that's great.
I can be trained. If you start south and go north, then do you have to bring all the equipment back over the new beach to get it out?
I think that in 2017, there was a pump out at Diane. We had 3 at,
There were 3, yeah. I was trying to think about it.
there was
as
one at
well.
Diane, and
I think there was one like around North Snow Geese, maybe a little bit north of that. But there was definitely one at Diane, and then there was another one up towards the northern end. Yep. So in terms of kind of what that looks like from somebody standing on the beach, I mean, these will be bigger ships than people are used to seeing that close to shore. That's a pretty good perspective of two of the dredges during the 2017 project hooked up to the pump out stations, but that's about what you would expect to see. Somebody asked about access. So what you see here in this picture is, I believe that the subline is coming on shore somewhere, in the background of this photo. But what's happened is they've turned and they're working their way north. This is down in Kildable Hills, and they just continue to add this pipe. And so the active construction area is actually off the picture to the north of here. And they'll keep going up as far as they can. Like James just said, at some point in time, the dredge doesn't have the capacity to push any further, and that's when they move to a different line, or they flip and build whatever they have to build on the other side of the line. But what you see here is that even though that pipe is on the beach, that doesn't mean the entire area where the pipe is closed off. They'll build these sand ramps, and there's specifications specifically in their contract that dictates how far apart those sand ramps will be. But they're built on a nice gentle slope that pretty much anybody can get up and over those. So we don't have people climbing over. Obviously some kids going to want to jump over it. My kids would want to jump over it for sure. But ideally we want people to use those sand ramps. But that's a convenience thing to make sure that pipe is not impacting access.
Ken?
Yes, sir.
I got a question for either James or Joe. You're going to be doing duck right during prime hurricane season. How much do you have to take off the beach if, in fact, we got a hurricane coming at us? I mean, is that a big demobilization?
That's a great question. And yes, depending on the size of the storm, we have different levels of planning to go in based on that storm level. We would try to get as much as possible out. It would be a large undertaking for Doug. You have to leave early. It's hard to take a chance when you don't have good access. When you have better access, it comes out a little easier to get on and off. But very, very tough. It's a great point. We're been talking a lot about that this week.
Did you ever consider reversing the plan, starting in duck?
It's really based on the equipment we have available. That is what dictated that as of right now. That being said, the good accesses that I say are down south, I wouldn't consider great accesses in general anyway. So extremely hard to access the beaches, just in the vicinity. So I'm not sure if that would dictate. It's basically mainly about what we have equipment available.
In terms of the dredges, yeah.
Dredge capacity.
Thanks, James.
I think we already covered that because we were getting into that sand fencing. All right, so I think we're getting into the last couple of slides here. We put this graphic up here, this list, just to show that in terms of the payment for this, so people are just kind of interested in how these projects are paid for. There's a number of things that are kind of lumped together with a project where we're participating with 3 other towns. So the mobilization cost is the biggest, but there are surveys of the borrow area that are required. There are bonds, performance and payment bonds that they have to provide. So the costs associated with those items are all lumped together. We can figure out what that one total cost is. And then the 4 towns split that cost based on the amount of sand in the contract for any given town. So if the town of Duck's or percent of sand is 20% of the total project, you pay 20% of that total number. And then every one of the towns has a different unit cost for the amount, for the volume of sand that's going to be placed. So earlier we talked about 494,000 cubic yards of sand. That's the total amount of sand that'll be placed on, or the total amount in the contract that'll be placed for the town of Duck. That's simply multiplied by that unit cost. For Duck, that number is $10 a cubic yard. So real easy math on that part. And then we did have some additive bid items. So sand fencing is also part of Weeks's contract. And something else that we're doing a little bit different this go round, we've included the post-construction survey, which is really like that baseline survey that we will compare all of our future surveys in terms of monitoring. We've actually put that on them because they will have surveyors out here as the project is going along. It's easy for them to mobilize those folks. So they've provided a cost up front. And what that allows us to do is last time our firm did the post-construction survey, but we waited until all 4 of the towns were done. So the town of Kitty Hawk's project was finished in October, middle of October. I think we did the survey in December. Adam will say, yes, we did it in December because I remember freezing up here in December. But we did that survey in December. But the town of Duck's project was completed in mid-June, late June, something like that. So there was a gap of what had happened over the course of several months. This time around, in their spec, that post-construction survey is done for each town separately within 2 weeks of when your project is constructed. So as soon as Kill Devil Hills is done, within 2 weeks, that survey is done. We lock that volume in. As soon as Kitty Hawk is done, 2 weeks later, that survey is done. And we think that that's going to help us track those volumes a lot better as we go on into the future. So,
Ken, as a follow-up on that, I was going to ask, as one of the questions was about the post-construction survey, if the entire town was going to be done. So when will, but this is great, because obviously the quicker you get a lock on what we have in place, the better. So that sounds really good. When could we expect the entire town's next survey to happen? It sounds like it won't be part of this bid.
Actually, it is for Duck. So these guys their surveyors end up doing, with this arrangement, they'll end up doing 4 surveys. They do 1 survey within a month or 2 prior to the project at 500-foot spacings. And that data is like the latest and greatest data that allows Adam and I to go back and kind of reestablish what all of those lines are going to be, and kind of reshuffle the deck if it needs to, get a better condition survey right before the project. And then in order for them to get paid, they do these surveys at 100-foot spacing during the project. So 7 days before any sand is placed in any part of the town, they have to do a survey out to at least as far as the sand is going to be placed. It doesn't have to go all the way out to our depth of closure. It just has to go out far enough that it will cover the area that sand will be placed. And then as soon as they're done constructing a particular part of the beach, their surveyors who will be on site will go right out there, and on that same line at 100-foot spacings, they'll run that same survey out to where they've placed sand. And those data are provided to Adam and I, and they'll compute a volume, we'll compute a volume, and make sure that it matches up. But that's the volume that they get paid off of. So that's 3 surveys now. And then the 4th survey is that post-construction survey. So for the town of Duck, who historically has surveyed not only the project area, but the entire town, The pre-construction survey that they'll do a month or two before the town to help us reshuffle the deck, that will only include the project area. But the post-construction survey that happens 2 weeks after the project is finished includes all of the town, the entire town.
That's great.
That's built in.
So just for clarification purposes, that means the entire town's last full survey would have been this past year, 2021.
Correct. So all of the latest survey we have right now is from April 2021, and we'll get pre-con for the project area, but the post-con, call it October of 2022 will be the next survey in line for the whole town.
And then I got a request from our AV to repeat what James said about the schedule and why we are going last versus first. For the audience that's watching from YouTube, just wanted to, and correct me if I'm wrong, the reason Duck is going last is primarily has to do with the equipment that you have available, because you have the smaller boats, smaller dredges that can move closer to the Barrow area and Kildover Hills early, and you'll have a larger dredge later in the season. Also, part of that, yes, if there's a hurricane, you would have to demobilize based on the level of your policy in terms of hurricane standards, correct?
Correct.
Good. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to move on to that one. Two things about monitoring. So everybody is interested in, the turtles. Nobody, we're placing sand on the beach. We've got bulldozers on the beach in the summer. Are you going to hurt anything? That's a big concern. So there is a huge amount of environmental review that goes through these projects, from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the Corps, the state fisheries, National Marine Fisheries, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, tons and tons of review. There are oodles of nighttime reading of anybody that's interested in reading these documents. But the permit conditions require that during the project, since we're building this in the summertime, that before, in the morning during the turtle nesting season, the entire beach has to be swept before the dredge contractor could go outside of those fences. So outside of their active construction area, a lot of times you'll see trucks or equipment will be switched out. All of that stuff needs to happen outside of or after the morning clearing of the beaches. So the Nest group that's a local group up here, the Network for Endangered Sea Turtles, they're actually going to be doing that monitoring on a day-to-day basis from May 1st through November 15th. And then another group will have a contract to provide staff that can literally be on site all night long during dark hours to observe the construction area to make sure that if a turtle were to come into that construction area, that they've got the ability to let the contractors know there's a procedure for shutting things down. The lights have to go off and things like that to make sure that there is no disturbance for that. And then if a nest is actually laid, that same group has the ability to go in there and relocate that nest. That morning, come in and use the equipment to dig that nest up and relocate it to a place that will not be disturbed. So all of that's approved by the resource agencies, and a lot of detail on how that's done. And then one other type of monitoring that wasn't included in the first project, some of the agencies have required what's called benthic monitoring. So what they're interested in is, it's pretty well understood that when you're placing this amount of sand on a beach, that there are critters that live in that sand. There are mole crabs, there are clams, there are worms, there's all kinds of things that live in that sand. Some of them can migrate out of the area as at the speed that the sand is being pumped. Some of that some of those areas they're sort of smothered up, but it's pretty well understood that over the course of a year or two, that sand is recolonized. I was talking the other day about how we live down in the southern part of the state, but those beaches are renourished like every 3 years, but you can go down there right after renourishment, and the kids are like digging in the sand. They're like, where are all the sand crabs? I'm like, they just placed the sand out here. We'll come back next year, they'll be there. But you go back the next year, and there's tons and tons of them. So just the casual observer can kind of see that cycle. But in terms of having data and being able to show that in fact that has happened here, and the numbers are what would be expected, they've put a monitoring regimen in place for this project. And so there's a number of stations that'll be surveyed, that will be sampled. They'll basically take a scoop of sand, they sieve it through a bucket to get some of the sand out. Whatever critters are left in there, they pour them into a jar, put formalin in there, and then we ship them off to a biologist that literally counts them all and tells us how many and of what species. And we'll have that for each station that's predetermined on that map for directly before the project is constructed, literally within a couple of days or a couple of weeks of after a section is constructed, and then a year after the project is completed. And we'll submit that data as part of the permit requirement to the agencies. All right, so schedule. This is the schedule that we're looking at this point in time, and we've been joking around with all the time. Say anytime that anybody says anything about schedule, the very next thing out of their mouth should be subject to change. Subject to change. This could change tomorrow. All right, so the schedule as it is right now would be that Kill Double Hills would be the first project constructed, starting sometime around early June, estimating somewhere between 30 and 35 days for that project. Then they'll continue moving north into Kitty Hawk. And that volume's a little bit more, looking at somewhere around 40 days for that. So that gets us into mid-August, moving straight into Southern Shores. And then the town of Duck, we've got right now about 30 days are assumed that from mid-September to mid-October. So at this point in time, actually that Kitty Hawk, Kill Double Hills thing just flip-flopped over the last 24 hours, and I sent an email to Dorothy at the county that it may have been updated on the town's website or the county's website at this point, but everything's subject to change. We, having gone through it in 2017, we're well aware that communication is the key, that people want as much information as we can. We just have to continually caveat that we're going to be as transparent as we feel comfortable being, but everybody's got to understand that these things can change quickly. All right, so last slide, moving forward, those pre-construction surveys, like I said, those are done about 6 weeks prior to construction, between 1 and 2 months prior to the construction. Tentative schedule looking at around 30 days from mid-September to mid-October. Town-wide monitoring that was mentioned earlier, the initial post-construction survey that's done 2 weeks following completion of sand placement. That goes for both the project area for a baseline, and then north and south of the project area for the annual monitoring. And then continual annual monitoring will be on an annual basis, just as we have in the past for the 5-year design life is what's been planned for. And then we've also talked a little bit about the areas outside of the project area, looking at that vulnerability analysis that's been run before. That storm that was talked about earlier, that storm simulation model, running that for the entire town so that we can keep track of, are there areas outside of the project that could also be impacted by that same design storm. And we kind of preach that we're not looking at placing an equal amount of sand in front of everybody's house. We're trying to establish an equal amount of protection in front of everybody's house. So continuing to update that analysis helps us make sure that's
Can I ask a question about this slide on the, if the transparency is great and completely true, the more data and more information about, scheduling and subject to change and all that good stuff, the better. Everybody feels, I think, a lot more comfortable with the information. But if we have to suspend the construction project because of a storm in the time frame for Duck or any time, will that also be fairly transparent, whereby, let's just say the dredge has to leave because of storm, and they say that, got to go. I imagine you go into a safe harbor like Norfolk is what we were talking about last time. And then will you keep that really transparent in terms of when you're coming back? Because I know everyone will be wondering.
Yeah, absolutely we will. We have some weather built in. Obviously, hurricanes and storms like that, exceed that sometimes. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, everyone will know. We'll start with these guys, obviously, but if the dredge goes, that just, you'll see it either way. And
Great.
like I said, if we have a big evacuation, we'll have to get all of our stuff back. So it'll be coordinated very, I think, thoroughly with the engineers in the town. So.
Great, thank you.
Last time, there were a number of times where it wasn't necessarily a hurricane, but there were a number of times that the dredges did have to leave, and I think we were pretty good about, a few days ahead of time letting folks know that, hey, I mean, even things like fuel, like there will be times where the dredge won't be out there. It's going to have to go somewhere for something.
And everyone says, where are they?
Right. So that, we'll definitely keep all that information. As soon as we can get it and feel comfortable with the dates and stuff, we'll let people know, for sure.
Ken, I got just a curiosity question. Are you going to have any trouble bringing your equipment up through the core property, through the pier, under the pier?
That's what we have Sandy for.
I'm glad that's Sandy.
At this time, we haven't personally talked to them. I know Ken's been in contact in the past, and we don't foresee that. Obviously, everything needs to come up that way, so we don't foresee any problems getting through that.
I mean, legit.
It's public, right? So
Below the mean high water line would technically be public trust property. So, I mean, in terms of logistics, I think that was what James was talking about. They've looked specifically at the widths between the vents and things like that, the vertical clearance. They're comfortable that as long as they have permission, they can move everything through that pier, no problem. But the permits, the Corps of Engineers permits that have been issued, the state permits that have been issued, we have access points that are south of the Corps of Engineers facility. One of them was down at Bear Island Station. There was discussion about bringing stuff up from Southern Shore. So part of the process of reviewing this is that the agencies have permitted this project with the assumption that equipment could be coming up from the south.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but notification was also sent to the Corps of Engineers with plans.
That's correct. So what Sandy's talking about is part of the process for the Division of Coastal Management, the CAMA major permit, is that you have to formally send written notice to adjacent property owners. And the FRF was given that specific notice, was provided for that notice. That notice would have included those accesses south of there. So, yep. I mean, there'll definitely be more coordination as we get closer and closer, but that is the plan at this point.
What's the northernmost area that you're doing the nourishment? I know there's Army Pier is the south end, but
Skimmer Way, the very northern end of Skimmer Way, where it turns and goes west, that's pretty much the end of the northern taper. So I think if you came up Oyster Catcher to Skimmer Way and made a left-hand turn, the first two houses on your right are included in the actual design area, and everything from that second house down to the end of Skimmer Way is the taper.
so that's part of the taper, but not the main section.
Right. The main section would be those first, if you made a left onto Skimmer from Oyster Catcher, those first two houses on the right-hand side on the ocean front, those are in the main fill area. But as you keep going down Skimmer, you would then be in the taper.
I think the end of the nourishment is actually 142 or 144 Skimmer Way, and then
Sounds
from
familiar.
there down to 126 is going to be in the taper.
Questions? All right.
Well, thank you, Ken.
yeah.
Thank you.
Very informative. Are there more questions from the audience? Thank you, Adam. Thank you, James, Joe, for coming today. There being no other business, I'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Any discussion on the motion on the floor? There being none, all in favor of adjourning, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? The meeting is adjourned.